Justin A. Game was watching me play Space Harrier 2. I don't know. I don't really question what Justin does with his spare time. Anyway, he gets out this transparent film, like the stuff you use in an overhead projector, and starts drawing on it with a dry erase marker. I don't really care so long as he doesn't get any marker on the couch, but then he puts the film on the TV screen. And this is what I see. And before I have time to tell him to take that junk off the screen, he says this. The minimum difference is the smallest degree of change needed for a change to be significant to a mechanic. It's not an objective figure, it's just where you choose to start an investigation. With that in mind, I'd like to use this grid as a way of visualizing the minimum difference between enemy flight patterns. As you're dodging enemies, you tend to hang out in these 9 general areas. It's not specific, and it doesn't help us out with the randomly placed trees and bushes. But if you plot the joints of an enemy's flight path in these boxes, that tells you a good bit about the enemy's behavior. You also need to take into account how the enemy interacts with the foreground and background. For instance, can the enemy hit Harrier if it exits through the foreground? Does the enemy spawn in the foreground or in the background? Well, it's funny you say that, Justin. It's almost like I wrote that and then just put my words in the mouth of some imaginary character. But that would be a lot of trouble to go through for not much payoff. Anyway, I decided to humor Justin and plot the enemies as I saw them. For 2 enemies to be considered different, or meet the criteria for minimum difference, their flight path must be unique by at least 1 elbow, where each elbow is plotted on the 3x3 grid. Watch the enemy shadows as they hit the red dot. The shadows go through the very bottom of the screen, meaning that the enemies will collide with Harrier on that frame. Sometimes it'll look like an enemy is close enough to hit Harrier, but unless that shadow is all the way at the bottom, he's safe. In the future, I will color a dot red if an enemy can touch Harrier at that point. Although, if I do this for future levels, I might have to change that rule for the levels where you get a lot of red. I'll also leave a dot hanging off the edge if enemies fly off the screen by that border. This path highlights how hard it can be to plot these points, given Space Harrier 2's shifting perspective. Here, I've tried to put them where you would position Harrier to shoot down the enemies. Also note that these enemies do not fly forward far enough to touch Harrier. They turn around at the green point, stopping just 1 frame short of it. And, just as a general note, bear in mind that Harrier shots will not line up with the checkerboard floor. You would think that this flight path makes these enemies a cinch to kill, right? For that first line, they hang around at the very bottom and don't move far on the x-axis. However, because they don't move far on the x-axis, this path is dangerous. But think about it. Harrier himself is obstructing your view of anything directly ahead of him, and in order to shoot down enemies, you'll have to put Harrier directly in front of them. Remember, he can only shoot straight ahead. If enemies don't move on the X or Y axis, then Harrier will spend more time obstructing your view of them. During this time, they might be spawning shots that you can't see because they're smaller off in the distance. It's more to your advantage to have a spot where the enemies will fly by quickly. You can pick them off with shots as they fly by, and if you miss, at least you won't be blocking your view of them for long. I'm not sure what this says about variation. I feel like I should have reached some conclusion about the points that the different flight patterns hit. Well, it's at least worth noting that, in case you haven't noticed, enemy flight patterns are commonly mirrored horizontally.